Welcome to week 15 of exposure. And of course, what I'm exposing myself to in these videos is my fear of not doing things right, my fear of imperfection. And I do that by putting out a very imperfect video every week. And this week I am in San Francisco. In fact, it hasn't been a week since my last video. My last video was only 3 days ago. My last video was recorded the day before I left the Boston area, where I'd been with my family for almost 2 weeks at that point in time. And I didn't share much about that visit in the last video because what I was sharing was the thing I'd avoided sharing the week before, which was the fact, and let me say it again here, even though there's this terrific fear of judgment from you and self-judgment, the fact that my parents bought me a car, something I had not disclosed in the video I did subsequent to that, but then disclosed last week. So that was the big share last week, the big reveal. And I want to talk about my visit to my parents. And it's not just my parents. My parents live in a 2-family house with my sister and brother-in-law and my niece and 2 nephews. And it is just a source of great love, great comfort. Home, really, my home. Even though I've lived in New York and now I'm essentially living in San Francisco, at least I'm spending more time here than New York, that has been my home and that has been the place where I've gotten the most love. And there was a lot of love this time. There's always a lot of love there from everyone, literally from every single person there. But what I want to talk about mostly is my father, who has Alzheimer's. I don't know if it would even be considered middle or early stage at this point. It feels like it's more middle stage. Yeah, his memory is awful. His personality is still intact, though of course when you remove such a fundamental block of personality as memory, the whole architecture of personality shifts. It slumps in certain ways. Certain things are highlighted that were prior to that, maybe not so prominent. Other things that were very prominent become subsumed. So the shape of who he is still there, but it's different. But the core of who he is still there. And who he is honestly just the most wonderful person I've known, really. I mean, both of my parents, and I'm not just saying that because my mom may watch these, but my mother and I had a very contentious relationship when I was growing up. My father and I didn't, and I think part of that is just a function of the fact that he was working. My mother worked not at all or part-time. My father worked long hours. He was an oncologist, a lung cancer doctor, and someone who is very, very dedicated to his patients, but even more dedicated to his family. But he was home, just in time for dinner, and was gone the next morning when I left for school. Though we did a lot of long vacations together, I certainly didn't feel at all estranged from him. I felt like we had a close relationship growing up. But I would say now we're closer than we've ever been. And that's been a conscious choice on my part. When his Alzheimer's started to become unavoidably noticeable, I found myself sometimes getting frustrated at him, annoyed. And in fact, I saw this tendency to dismiss him. He would ask me to repeat a question and I would get annoyed. And I realized on an LSD trip that what was happening was, I was essentially burying him before he was dead because I wanted to cut off the pain of what I was already losing as he lost his memory. And I made a decision to not do that, to do the opposite, to really open up, to love and appreciate him. And I have adhered to that. And I don't think that's any great heroism on my part, because the fact is there is still more pleasure than pain in his presence for me. And in some way, there's more enjoyment than there's ever been. Yeah, I love him more than I've ever loved him. I'm closer to him, closer than I've ever been to him before, even though we can't have deep conversations. But I certainly spend more time with him now than I did before. And part of that is a function of the fact that he's not working. He was essentially forced into retirement right before the pandemic because patients and other doctors and nurses were noticing his memory lapses. So he's home. And um, yeah, part of it is the choice to really, really spend time with him. But I love his company. At times it's painful, but most of the time it's sweet. And part of it is, I think in some ways I'm his best friend now. I think my mother was always his best friend. Not that he didn't have male friends, but men of that generation, I think it was common that, yeah, he did do one-on-one things with friends occasionally, but more it was, couples things with my wife and often other doctors and their wives. And, but yeah, the family was, he was very, very, and is very, very devoted to the family. And my mother and him had this, I don't want to say perfect relationship. And now that his change is kind of, I think it's thrusting into relief, maybe challenges that they had in their relationship earlier. I'm not sure. I don't know. I can't say. I know them both very well, but I don't know the intimate details of their relationship and what it was like years ago and decades ago. But it always seemed to me like they had a wonderful relationship. They had a bicycle built for two. Now they've made a comeback, but I remember when they dropped me off at college and they were riding around campus on their bicycle built for two, and people were telling me about it who had seen them, not knowing they were my parents, because no one, this was early 90s, no one had actually seen someone riding a bicycle built for two. They would go to bed and breakfast for weekends. My father sometimes had hickeys, but also good for them. Yeah, like really not just loving each other, but I would say really in love, really just enjoying each other's company tremendously. And that has changed. My mother no longer, I'm hesitating because do I want to share things? Yeah, you know what? I'm not going to get into too much detail about this, but suffice to say, they are not equals. They are not partners in the true sense of that word, because they can't have deep conversations anymore. They can have the conversations my father is capable of are these very superficial conversations, often humorous, often joking. And I think somewhat unfortunately, often with my mother, the way he expresses his affection is teasing. And many couples do this. But when that's kind of all you have, I think it's very challenging. But again, I'm not going to get too much into that. I don't want to, I'm not going to share stuff that's not my story. I suppose I do when I'm talking about my father, but anyway, their relationship is strained in many ways. And my relationship with my father is not strained. And it was very, very sweet being with him. Very sweet being with him. And not painful. He was in a good mood. This is the thing, is his moods vary quite a bit. They didn't, when I was growing up, honestly, when I was growing up, I wasn't aware of him having moods. I wasn't aware of my mother having moods. I was so, I guess I would say self-absorbed in a way that probably is not unusual for kids and teenagers. But certainly there was never, and I realize how lucky I am, there was never a time where I felt like, oh, I'm worried about mom, I'm worried about dad. The only, as I've shared before, really the only major source of stress in their lives I perceived growing up was me. I was an extremely volatile, emotionally volatile kid and teenager. Now, I don't think that's true. I think there were certainly other challenges I'm sure they faced, but yeah, genuinely, even to this day, I don't know about them. And not because they concealed things. I think they're successful human beings. They both came from, I think, what certainly now would be considered at least small t trauma. My father, growing up what we would call poor at this point, sharing a bed with his brother, his family of four living in a one-bedroom apartment. But this was, when he was growing up, there was sort of a lower middle class that was actually viable. You didn't necessarily feel deprivation. I don't think he felt deprivation, but he certainly felt emotional deprivation. His parents very, very clearly favored his older brother. And that drove him to achieve a lot, to study his ass off, to get into Yale Medical School after going to Queens College. To me, this is remarkable. Like, with his test scores, he clearly could have gotten a scholarship to an Ivy League school. Both of my parents could have, but each of them applied to exactly one college, which was the college closest to where their families lived. They weren't going to move away from home for college. There was no money for that. Anyway, yeah, my mother lost her father when she was 16. So both of them had suffered real losses, but somehow, despite that, built really wonderful lives for themselves and for their families, and are just great fucking parents, are wonderful, wonderful, dedicated, loving, skilled, gifted, I would say. Sure, I'm sure parenting, I've never thought about it before this moment, but parenting, I'm sure like anything else, there's an element of talent. Anyway, yeah, I lost my train of thought. Oh, right, my father's moods. So now, certainly, he very clearly is sometimes not in a good mood. And the reason is always the same heartbreaking reason, because of his condition. I think, and I don't know, but I think he probably always has some awareness that, there is a decline, a fairly dramatic decline at this point. But I think the degree of that awareness, or at least his consciousness of it, changes fairly radically, because I think, as my mother has shared, she says, I would be terrified if I was in his position. But he doesn't seem terrified, but I think the strategy he uses, and this is also heartbreaking because I think it's the only viable strategy, is to deny the reality as much as you can, as often as you can. And I think he's pretty good at that. And maybe he's good at that because maybe he had to do that as a kid growing up. Maybe he had to deny the reality that his parents clearly favored his brother. I mean, how painful must that be? So my first 4 or 5 days there, he seemed in a good mood. And then one day my mother came home. They go to movies a lot now because that's an activity they can do. But that is becoming increasingly challenging. My father is having more and more difficulty following the plots of even rudimentary plots. And they'd seen some movie, and my father had wanted to see it, but my mother asked him afterwards, what did you think of it? He said, it wasn't that great. And she could tell it was because he had trouble following it. And that, in her estimation, because my father doesn't share about this. So I'll get to that in a moment. In her estimation, she felt like that drove home the point that, yeah, he's losing his mind in some ways, in some very, very fundamental ways. And that put him in a bad mood. My father is overtly in denial about the Alzheimer's at times. He will tell my mother, and of course he doesn't remember seeing the neurologist and getting the diagnosis. So when my mother sometimes brings it up, he will deny it. He'll say, yeah, my memory's not what it used to be, but I'm 77. But at other times he does acknowledge it, and again, generally in fairly heartbreaking ways. And I had one of those ways. So when my mother came home and told me this, I try to cheer up my father, but it's not like we never talk about the elephant in the room. Cheering him up is just making little inane jokes or watching a Celtics game with him and watching movies is something we love doing together too. And I think it was the next day. I'm just going to share, by the way, I'm in this space where I'm like, oh, what I'm doing right now sucks artistically, creatively. All right, anyway, let's continue. As I've often said, if this feels bad, wrong to me, then that means it's a good exposure. So, my father and I are watching a movie a day or two later. We were watching A Man Called Otto, a Tom Hanks movie, because we had recently watched Forrest Gump together, and that had been a great movie for us to watch. He didn't seem to have trouble with the plot. I enjoyed it. I'd never seen it before. He had seen it before, but didn't remember it. So we watched this movie, A Man Called Otto, and about midway through, my father made some remark about how it was a confusing movie. And I kind of just reacted with a little bit of annoyance, just a little bit, but I said something like, oh, I think it's a pretty straightforward plot. And my father said, yeah, I seem to be having, what did he say exactly? I have a lot of trouble understanding most things now. And he didn't say it defensively or justifying anything. He didn't say it self-pityingly. It was just put forth as a statement of fact. And we're there in the dark, and I just started crying silently. Not sobbing, but just tearing up. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing I grapple with what it's like for my mother and how agonizing it is for her. But I know, I mean, I don't know her inner experience, but we talk openly about it. So I know what she's going through. And that also has been a conscious choice, because at times I've found myself wanting to shut her down, wanting to not hear, wanting her to not share her pain. But I've made the very conscious choice to encourage her to share her pain with me, because I don't want her to carry it on her own. I mean, my sister supports her, and she's in therapy now, finally. She has a good therapist. But ultimately, yeah, I feel like I can play a fairly indispensable role in helping her share. So I know what she goes through to some extent, but I don't know what my father's experience is. But it was very clear to me on this visit that, yeah, his life, I mean, he had a great life. He built a great life for himself. A great life for himself. I mean, just the fundamentals. He had a job that he really deeply valued, even though it was painful. I mean, he would come home from work sometimes and cry at the dinner table because one of his patients had died. Because you deal with lung cancer patients, 95% of them are going to die. And he was very, very deeply affected by that. He didn't close himself off, which is pretty amazing considering his background, considering he was never in therapy. Like, all the tools I have to use very consciously to keep my heart open in the face of pain, IFS and meditation and physical acceptance and somatic awareness and psychedelics, he doesn't have any of those. But somehow I think what we have in common is just this very, very deep sensitivity. And somehow he was able, for me, that sensitivity led in some ways to the OCD, because things hurt too much. And I came up with these strategies of avoiding pain, OCD, that create more pain. And somehow he didn't need to do that. So, lost my train of thought again. All right. Anyway, I don't know what it's like for him. How can I know what it's like for him? Oh, right. I was saying it's worse. It's unquestionably worse. It's unquestionably worse. I think some people, like Anna, my partner, when her grandfather had Alzheimer's, he actually became happier by all accounts. And I believe that does happen for some people. But yeah, my father led a very vital life. He served many people through his work and our family. And he just, enjoyed, I think, his life in a lot of ways, in all the important ways: love, work, connection. And all of those have been drastically curtailed. Sometimes he'll say to me, it's hard not working. Yeah, I mean, he just watches TV for hours a day and alone, almost always alone. So that's part of why I like being there, is I feel like it's better for him. But again, this isn't some great altruism on my part. I love it. I love being with him. And even watching A Man Called Otto, just feeling my heart fucking breaking, tears rolling down my face, I was just like, this is precious. This is sacred that I get to do this. But unsurprisingly, there started to be some OCD over the course of this visit. So I'd shared before how one of the forms OCD can take for me is what I call weed OCD, the decision whether or not to smoke marijuana. And that came to a head a few months ago, and so I took a break from weed to just kind of take it off the table, and that was good. But I've started smoking again on my regular schedule, which is like once or twice a week. But I also see the danger even in that once or twice a week, because I can obsess about it. Like, when should I smoke? And that was cropping up over this visit. And then some obsessing about, oh, should I go for a hike or should I just stay here with the family? And I wound up going for a hike one day, and I had this real OCD regret, like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I had just stayed here and hung out with my father. But a sweet visit, a really sweet visit, and sweet with the kids. They were on vacation for school and spending a lot of time with them. And yeah, just, I'm very comfortable there. I'm very comfortable there. And so I think, unsurprisingly, the combination, so the OCD, of course, it comes in to save me from pain, even though it ultimately creates more pain. And I've gotten tremendous freedom by instead being very willing to feel the pain. And even as I was having this low-level OCD about, should I smoke weed, what I was doing is really tuning into the sensations of pain there, the loss, not going into my head. And then the day before I was going to leave, I predictably had OCD about maybe I should stay longer. And I say predictably because this happens. This is one of the, I would say, lingering forms of OCD for me. And being very specific is when I'm visiting my family, I very often, if I don't have a deadline, if it's not like, well, I have to get back to New York for a show or San Francisco for an event or whatever, I almost always will have some element of maybe I should stay here longer. And that came in. Of course it came in. And it was like, yeah, this is so precious, this time with my father. And I'm so comfortable here. Like, I get love here effortlessly, and it's safe love. And of course, my partner, Anna, is back in San Francisco. But as I've shared before, there is a part of me, even though the relationship feels very solid right now, there is a part of me that wants to not end it, but just kind of wants it to fade away, like fade out, like an image fading out, just like painlessly just dissipate into the ether. This is I don't literally want that, but a part of me does. A part of me just kind of, because as much as I love her, there is this deep vulnerability there. And even though it feels relatively solid and safe, I think when your heart is this open, you can never feel totally safe, because no matter how committed she is, and no matter how committed I am, you never know what's going to happen. One of us could meet someone else. One of us could die. That is my biggest fear, is something happening to her in that regard. So the love I get from her and give to her is very sweet, but the fear is, it's proportionate, I think. I think the more I love her, the more fear there will be. Whereas with my family, it's almost like a freebie. There's really not fear. Now there is starting to be fear, of course, of my father declining further and my parents eventually dying. But that's the only way they can really hurt me. They're not going to hurt me in any other way. Like, I'm totally confident they're not going to, it's a very, very safe relationship. And it just feels very comfortable there. I'm using that word a lot, but it's like I wake up and I go out onto their little porch, even in the winter, look at the bare skeletal trees, the architecture of tree branches in winter I love. I really get off on that nature. And in the spring and summer when the trees are leafing out, that's beautiful. So look at the trees. Write in my journal if it's not too cold on the deck. Go in, do a little work, meditate, eat breakfast with my dad, do some more work, take a walk, hang out with the kids. It's just a very pleasant existence. My basic needs are met, because what are the basic needs? Obviously food and shelter, but connection, human connection. And so I came in this thought, like maybe I should stay longer, but I knew it was so charged because I was so heartbroken over my dad. I knew if I started to go down this rabbit hole, it would be extraordinarily painful. So I did something that is a huge fucking victory for my OCD recovery. I just didn't think about it. I didn't check, what are plane tickets like if I leave 3 or 4 days later? As I'm saying that like that's a lie. I did check once, but only once. I just didn't really think about it. I was like, you know what? I'm just sticking with my decision. I'm going to leave as planned. And I did. But, I'm at the point in my OCD recovery, it's very puzzling to me. So when I'd mark my recovery, when I really started recovering from OCD, was right around 2009, 2010. So it kind of hit its nadir, and I started recovering thanks to psychedelics, thanks to a 12-step OCD program, thanks to a good therapist, a number of things. Those are the three primary things I'd say. And yeah, I feel very disconnected, and I'm not even really breathing right. And I think sometimes when I feel disconnected, it's because I'm avoiding something, but I don't think I'm avoiding anything here. I don't think there's anything I'm not sharing. Anyway, whatever. This is, again, the purpose of this exercise, first and foremost, is to expose myself to the fear and the feelings that I'm doing this wrong. So bravo, I'm doing that. Okay. Yeah, when I started recovering from OCD, yes, it's hard. Recovery is always hard because to recover from OCD, you have to choose momentarily more pain. Because if you give into your ritual or your obsession, there's always some little hit of relief, even if the hit of relief is only the promise or the possibility that I could get relief. Just the thought that, oh, I might get relief if I do this, if I engage in this compulsion or obsession. Just that thought itself gives some relief, even if you don't actually get relief, if that makes sense. So to abstain, to not do the thing, means sitting with a heightened level of discomfort. But what I found was that heightened level of discomfort dropped pretty quickly. So basically, if I'm willing to endure, a half hour, an hour of more intense suffering, then it passes and I feel great peace and freedom. So basically, the cost benefit for recovery, for abstaining from engaging with OCD, there was a very clear benefit, and the cost was fairly short-lived. But now that I'm like the OCD, I feel like maybe I'm like an army, wiping out the last vestiges of the opponent, but these are the most pernicious ones. Pernicious? I think I'm pronouncing that right. These are the Navy SEALs who are really good at hiding and sniper attacks. I don't know. It just feels like basically what I'm trying to get to is recovery has gotten more painful. Recovery at this point means don't engage with the thoughts. Feel the feelings. But the feelings were just agonizing that last day. It just felt in my body so wrong. This deep feeling of loss, of mourning, this certainty that I'm making a terrible mistake by not changing my ticket and spending more time at my parents' place. And knowing intellectually that if I change the ticket, I'll probably feel like that's the wrong thing, so I'm sticking with this. But just feeling anguish, just an anguish I don't know how to describe it. Just horrible, overwhelming pain. Yeah. And I called Anna, my partner, and I'm always leery of calling her when I'm in OCD, but I felt like this was a little safer. So what I mean when I'm in OCD is when I define being in OCD as when I'm actively engaging with the OCD. So in this case, being in OCD would be checking plane tickets, thinking about it well, maybe I should change my ticket. What would it be like? What would it be like if I came back a few days later? What would it be like if I stayed here a few days longer? That's the OCD, and I wasn't doing that. I was just feeling the pain, but it just felt so wretched, and I felt so alone with it. And I told myself, lean into the discomfort, and I was. So I was using all my tools, which was basically getting on my meditation cushion, becoming present a little bit, and then really going into the feeling, this wrong, broken feeling, this pain that I feel right in the center of my heart, really embracing it, leaning into it, sensing the contours, the minute physical variations in my chest area where I feel that pain. Sending it love in an IFS, internal family systems way, telling those feelings they have a right to be there. I'm glad they're there. They're not alone. I'm with them. And praying for more willingness to really feel these feelings, praying for willingness to make the wrong decision. And doing that periodically over the course of my last day in Boston. And when I would do this, I would get a little more peace. The pain would decrease from a 9.5 to a 7 for maybe 15, 20 minutes, but then it would just roar back in. And at a certain point, I'm just all right, I'm just strapping myself to this mast. I just have to have some sort of faith that this will get easier. But it didn't get easier that day. And so, I called Anna, not in an OCD way, I'm struggling with this decision, but just with the pain, but she couldn't really help much. And as soon as I got off the phone, I felt doomed. I felt like this relationship is doomed. Of course I'm going to lose her because of this. And I got on the plane, and I actually felt okay once I was on the plane. But then I landed here, and yeah, I'd say I already felt like, when I say I felt okay, I felt broken. I felt broken. And there can be a liberation in feeling broken and feeling like, well, it doesn't even really make a difference what I do. I'm just surrendering. I'm just surrendering to just my desperation, my confusion, my hopelessness. And in that, paradoxically, there is a sort of hope and a peace. So I felt okay on the plane. I actually felt better than okay. I mean, I felt pride too. I was like, I fucking did it. I really didn't go with OCD. I sat with the pain. My prayers were answered. I was very willing to feel my feelings. I was very willing to make the wrong decision. I fully surrendered to that pain. Or maybe not fully, but, mostly. But of course, then the plane landed, and then I had to pick up my new car, the car that I was very, very conflicted about. And I want to now go into more about the car. You can watch the last video. Suffice to say, I realized how tremendously privileged this feels. And I didn't share this when it happened at the time. I did share all about this last week, but it happened like 2 weeks ago because I was afraid of your judgment. Because I feel like I would judge someone, a middle-aged man whose parents are buying him a car. And yeah, needless to say, there was a lot of conflict also about which car should I get. So anyway, I bought the cars I shared in the last video, literally like an hour and a half before my flight took off, and rushed to the airport, and now I'm going to pick up the car. And of course, very predictably, I did not want to pick up this car. I was like, maybe can I back out of this? But I'm not going to do that. Recovery, that's another prayer. I pray for the willingness to put my recovery first. And clearly recovery is just picking up this fucking car. And so I did. And I got there, and the salesman, he's like, great, we held on to it for you. And he's like, just look around, take an inspection, because once you drive it off the lot, it's yours. And of course the thought popped in, well, does that mean if I don't drive it off the lot, I can back out of this? But I didn't. I drove it off the lot, and immediately, of course, I hated it. I hated it. I'm not going to keep saying what I'm going to say, but I'll say it one more time. Yes, I know how privileged this is. Yeah. I hated the new car that my mommy and daddy bought me. It's a Corolla hybrid, and it makes this sound that the Federal Transportation, whatever, some government agency that regulates cars requires the cars hybrids to make and electric cars to make, so that pedestrians on their phones don't get hit by. There's a warning sound essentially that I find incredibly abrasive. And in fact, when I'd first test drove this car, I immediately ruled it out. I was like, that sound annoys me, and I'm incredibly noise sensitive. But then on subsequent test drives, I didn't really notice it anyway. It's bothering me tremendously, and I was just tired, and I rushed. I had to rush straight to do a show at the Punchline, which was fun. But I was, the pain was there. And then seeing Anna that night, and this is a thing that's a dangerous thing for our relationship, is, as I've shared before, growing up with often very intense emotional distress. I think in some ways, part of the dynamic with my mother is that the stress became magnified in her presence in an almost performative way. Not consciously, but I think there's a part of me that was like, really shared my distress because I wanted mommy to fix it. And I can see that being echoed in my relationship with Anna. I think sometimes if I'm in her presence, it's not like I'm artificially magnifying the distress, but I'm giving it more voice, more play than I would if I was just alone. And I've been here for a couple of days now, and it has been challenging. I have hated my car and deeply regretted it and felt like, why did I get it? Why could have just kept renting cars and not expose myself to this, even though at the same time I'm aware that this is a very good OCD exposure for me. Like, I have this awareness that if something feels wrong, it probably means I'm moving in the direction of more freedom and recovery, because, the brain, there's neural pathways get worn in, and I'm going against those, and it's very painful. And in fact, I had the thought when I was really, really suffering that last night in Boston, like, oh, this is withdrawal. The same way an opiate addict goes through physical withdrawal, I am perhaps going through withdrawal right now from OCD. By sticking with this decision, it just feels incredibly, incredibly uncomfortable. So, yeah, it's been a painful few days. I've been in the Bay Area. I love Anna. It's sweet being with her. But I do miss being home. But I'm not thinking about it. That's the key thing. I'm not thinking about what would it be like if I was at home. I'm just accepting that this is where I am. And I'm accepting also that part of why a part of me wants to be home is, again, this relationship is scary in a way. But the great thing, the thing that is giving me the most joy in this relationship is sleeping together. I don't mean sex. I mean literally sleeping together. Yeah, the great comfort in feeling her body next to me in slumber is priceless. And she's there for it. You know, I've just, felt quite crazy and quite broken the last couple of days, and she has been patient. So, and then finally this morning, I cried. It was the first cry I've had since I've gotten here. You know, and crying is what a great gift. What a blessing. I mean, it's a grace, crying. And I didn't cry for like 15 years when I was on SSRIs. I've been off SSRIs now for 15 years. And I take great pleasure in my cries. And I cried once or twice when I was at my parents' place. I cried after the movie A Man Called Otto, when I said goodnight to my father and went downstairs. I sobbed, and that felt good. But yeah, I needed another cry. And this morning I cried thinking about my father and felt a lot looser and more free. And grateful. Yeah. Grateful for Anna. Grateful for my car. Grateful for the recovery I have, but also really appreciating, like, man, there were moments, and I'm still not out of the woods, by the way. I was texting with my mother today, and so one reason I wanted to stay is it's going to snow. It's going to snow in Boston Sunday, tomorrow, and snow is my absolute favorite. And snow with the kids is even more magical. And I was texting with my mom, and she said, "Oh, we're just waiting for the snow to come. Too bad, you're going to miss it." And of course, the last thing she was trying to do was trigger me. But of course, that is what it did. And I wanted to check the weather. I wanted to check the weather to reassure myself, well, it's not going to be that much snow. But no, I'm not doing it. I'm not checking the weather. But that hurts too. I guess what I'm trying to get to is recovery, at least the stage I'm at now. Surprisingly, again, I think I'm pretty far down the recovery road. But this is, I think, the most painful recovery has been. Maybe the very, very early stages, 15 years ago, 13 years ago were worse. But this is like, super intense. And I think part of why it's intense, to wrap this all up, is, to wrap this very imperfect exposure up, is the OCD is really trying to protect me from this loss of my father. The OCD is trying to figure out little things that don't ultimately matter. Well, if you smoke weed, you'll feel good. Yeah, well, it's not going to cure my father's Alzheimer's. Well, if you stay longer, you'll feel good. Ditto. So, that's where I'm at. And that's it. I'm done. I'm done with this one. I'll see you next week. Maybe. There aren't a lot of viewers, and I suspect even fewer repeat viewers.